Welcome back. Thanks for sticking with us as we build a foundation to critically evaluate what the world is throwing at us as truth. Last time we worked through what science is and showed how the definition has changed over time. What's especially important to hang on to is what we talked about on the scientific method. Understanding the importance of how we obtain knowledge is key to dealing with this week's issue. Let's differentiate between two types of science. To help us with this issue, please allow me to introduce you to Dr. John Lennox. Dr. Lennox is a professor of mathematics at the University of Oxford and Emeritus Fellow in Mathematics and the Philosophy of Science at Green Templeton College.
And when someone like the geneticist, the Harvard geneticist, Richard Lewontin, says, you know, evolution is a fact, like the orbiting of the planets round the sun is a fact. And then he goes on to say, non-birds became birds. But just a minute. Apart from the very important question as to what a non-bird might be, nobody's ever seen a non-bird become a bird. And he's making a fundamental confusion between two kinds of science. One we could call empirical laboratory science, and the other we could talk about as historical science. That is, inferring something happened in the past. But he's got no mechanism. So to say that the thing that hasn't been observed is in the same category as the observed is to make a very serious fundamental error.
Let me illustrate the difference between empirical science and historical science using a clip from one of the Jurassic Park movies. Take a listen.
Sick of scratching around in rock and bone and making assumptions and deductions about the nurturing habits of animals that have been dead for 65 million years.
Think about what Dr. Sarah Harding said here. I'm sick of scratching around in rock and bone and making assumptions and deductions about the nurturing habits of animals that have been dead for 65 million years. Let me give you one more quote to drive home the point that I'm trying to make. The truth is that even if you find a totally complete dinosaur skeleton, you can't just string it together. To do that, you'd have to know exactly how its muscles, cartilage, and ligaments were arranged, and those are gone forever. Any reconstruction is a hypothesis. He continues, as theoretical as this kind of work is, arranging these kinds of fossils is the relatively easy part of paleontology. What you don't see in museum displays are the scores of headless, legless, ribless, smashed, crushed, and half-digested fossils that paleontologists depend on for much of their knowledge of extinct life. Many researchers find themselves sifting through piles of bones of animals that were washed down ancient rivers, mismatches of many kinds of small creatures, trying to decide which piece goes with which. What they are saying is very clear, and that is, historical science has very big limitations. Let's define these two types of science.
Have you ever heard this? Billions of years ago, there was an explosion in space. Or 100,000 years ago, this happened or that happened. Or even, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Question, how does anyone know? I mean, was anybody there to observe it? Well, actually somebody was, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Check this out. First of all, we need to recognize that there is a huge difference between observational science and historical science. Both are valuable, but very different.
Empirical or observational science uses the scientific method and is limited to what can be observed with our five senses. And that's because observational science, by taking observations and testing things, can tell us how something works, but not why. Remember, this is the way that we were able to create things like medicines and computers and rockets, observing and testing. Dr. Paul Weiss confirms the importance of this in his textbook entitled Elements of Biology. There he states, one-time events on Earth are outside of science. Biologist John Moore reinforces this by saying that at the core of scientific method or methods is experimental repeatability or reproducibility. The important distinction between science and those other systemizations, the arts, philosophy, and theology, is that science is self-testing and self-correcting. The testing and correcting are done by means of observations that can be repeated with essentially the same results by normal persons operating by the same methods and with the same approach. But what about historical science?
Through historical science, we consider things that happened in the past, but they cannot be checked in the same way. I mean, we don't have access to the past like we do the present because, well, it's gone, right? All we really have is speculation, or at best, circumstantial evidences of past events based on what we see in the present. That's not to say that we can't make intelligent guesses about the past, or form reasonable inferences from rocks or fossils in the present, but we certainly cannot directly test our conclusions because we cannot repeat the past. Got it?
Am I saying that historical science is unimportant?
Not at all. Let's drop an example down here for a minute and take a look at the Eiffel Tower. You know, that 19th century Parisian monument designed by Gustave Eiffel that stands 1,063 feet tall, which was built as the entrance for the 1889 World's Fair and is still the tallest building in Paris today, visited by millions of people each year? Yeah, that one. Well, guess what? Everything I just told you is true, but how do we test it? Well, applying observational science, we can, of course, observe the Eiffel Tower anytime we're in Paris. It's here in the present. Then, we can continue by testing the height and comparing it to all the other structures in Paris and confirm the claim that it is indeed the tallest building in Paris. But that's the extent of the kind of facts that can be proved by observational science in reference to this claim. How do we really know that Gustave designed it? How do we really know it was built in the 19th century as an entrance to the 1889 World's Fair? How do we really know how many people visited? That's all in the past. It can't be repeated. For that kind of information, we need to go outside the limits of observational science and discover what has been communicated to us through historical documents and eyewitness accounts. And furthermore, we have to believe those eyewitnesses and documents are trustworthy. The same is true when we talk about the origin of the Earth. The Earth is here. We all agree with that.
So the question is, does observational science confirm that the world was created by God? And are there trustworthy documents and eyewitness accounts that confirm it?
Well, let's take the last part first. In short, what we're really asking is my original question: was anybody there to observe it? The answer is,
what do you think?
yes. God was there, and He told us how He created. He inspired people to write down His very words that became books that were compiled into a complete book called the Bible, which has been verified over and over again and has demonstrated itself to be totally trustworthy in all it claims and teaches. Even secular scholars will concede that the Bible accurately records historical events. Anyway, we have the most trustworthy revelation from the most trustworthy eyewitness.
One more question. Does historical science confirm the Bible?
Yes. And what's extremely important to realize is the observable fact that the universe is logical and orderly. That makes sense only if its creator is logical and has imposed order on his creation. It doesn't make sense at all if the universe is just an accident of a huge explosion. Also, our minds are able to comprehend many things about the universe, and that's only possible if the creator of the mind gave us the ability and desire to explore the universe. It doesn't make sense if our brains are byproducts of chance because we couldn't trust their conclusions to ever be accurate. And lastly, it only makes sense that we can observe and repeat an experiment if the universe consistently obeys the same laws from day to day, which only makes sense if a lawgiver created it that way and upholds it. So to be bluntly honest, science itself, whether observational or historical, is only possible because God exists and the Bible is true. I could go on, but enough said.
So let's summarize. Christians and non-Christians all have the same evidence. We all have the same rocks, stars, trees, and people. The reason that we explain the evidence so differently has nothing to do with the actual evidence or the observational empirical science. It has everything to do with the interpretation of the evidence or the historical science. Empirical science uses the scientific method to obtain knowledge. Historical science uses our beliefs about the past, speculation and deduction to obtain knowledge. I hope you are now able to differentiate between observational or empirical science and historical science, because it's vitally important to do that as we proceed. Now, I can hear some of you saying something like, who cares? Science is science. It doesn't matter what we think about the past. And if it's not you saying that, you will run into people who think like that, and unfortunately, many are in the church. One last point, please allow me to show you why this topic of what you believe about the past is so important. Let me do that by using a clip from the science fiction movie, The Fifth Wave. The movie is set in a world that is under attack from aliens. No one trusts each other, and killing to survive is just the way that it is. The heroine, Cassie, is trying to rescue her brother from the aliens. On her way, she writes this in her journal.
How do you rid the world of humans?
Help me!
First, you rid the humans of their humanity.
I find that very interesting. If you want to rid Earth of humans, rid them of their humanity. I personally believe that the easiest way and the most effective way to rid humans of their humanity is to rid them of their history. And what I mean by that is there are only two ways that everything that we see came into being. One, remember, eternal God that created the way that he said that he did. Or two, eternal gas that created via naturalistic processes. If number one is true, our humanity is based in the fact that we're created in the image of God, fearfully, wonderfully made. Our value is based on that fact. God created us and loved us enough to die for us, every one of us, while we were spitting on him. Nothing can give us more value than that. Nothing. Now, if number two is correct, then our humanity's value is based on what do we bring to the plate? Good looks, money, intelligence. By teaching a generation that man came about as a result of naturalistic processes has destroyed their value. This is why we must take a stand on the correct history. Our ruler, our standard must be the Word of God from the very first verse. And that's because if we can't trust the first book in the Bible, we'll never trust any of the others. With that foundation in place, you're now ready to start digging into the actual headlines, so next time we'll get critical. Not in a mean-spirited way, but in a critical evaluation of evidence way, which we're commanded to do. Until then, stay bold.